Hello there. I am your host, Wellington Tremaine, and this is my very uncreatively titled podcast, Animanga. I called it that because it was the first thing that came to my mind, and I really couldn't think of anything else. So if anybody has any ideas, shout out to me what they are because we could do with a different title. So if you have listened to the original upload of this episode, this is going to be very different because that original upload was not an actual podcast episode. It was a audio version of the video that I made discussing angels of death and why we should contextualize it using philosophy. So I've changed quite a few things so that this is an actual podcast episode. Right now, I am giving you a little introduction as to what this podcast is actually about. So I thought a really long time about this. I started writing multiple episodes only to scratch them and rewrite them or lose the script somewhere due to the vagaries of life. And then I would have to start again and then do it all over again. And then I would lose it again. It was not fun. But I finally started writing what is the episode following this one, not the interlude, because I had a little revelation, if you will. I had already been planning to focus on particular themes and wanted to bring philosophy into the mix, but I didn't really have a solid foundation. I knew I wanted to do this thing. I had all these ideas. It was wonderful, but I needed a solid ground to be working from. Like, what am I doing this for? Well, I realized that one thing I had been super bummed about after graduating from Mount Holyoke College was that I hadn't gotten to complete an undergraduate thesis. There's a whole bunch of things that happened that contributed to this, really completely out of my control. So even though I had wanted to do one, I just missed out, basically. My major happened to be self designed, and I called it Aesthetics and Perception in Literature and Art. And it hit me literally just like a week ago as of writing this. Which is, okay, so maybe like actually 3 weeks ago, that this was subconsciously my way of writing the thesis that I never got to write. So the point of this podcast is quite literally going to be me justifying my undergraduate degree, which I don't really have to do for anybody except myself, but I wanted to bring materials to people and who didn't get to have my experience. I'd like to share my experience because I had a lot of fun in my undergraduate degree. My degree was supposed to be about understanding our world through art and literature and examining how that corresponds to the way philosophers have tried to explain our experiences. So I wanted to do something slightly different. What I wanted to do with this anime specific podcast is to actually teach philosophy using anime. A lot of contemporary attempts to discuss philosophy with younger and younger generations comes in the form of TikToks and dumbed down YouTube videos where really important philosophical ideas are reduced to quirky little summaries that don't actually examine the literature or show people how to understand or find important materials on philosophy. And sometimes you run into really great explanations, but it doesn't necessarily talk about philosophy in relation to other things, which is probably why that philosophy and series is so popular. Like if you go to Barnes and Noble, you'll see them where the titles are like Harry Potter and philosophy or Spider-Man and philosophy. And I've looked at the contents of those books in the bookstore before, and I wasn't exactly impressed. So what I wanted to do was to do it my way. Like that's literally what I want to do. I just want to write it the way that I would write it. So I wanted to bring all of my research acumen and philosophical knowledge to you guys, the public. I want the wonderful eclectic education that I received to be accessible to other people because, again, I really enjoyed my time there and I think I learned a lot of really cool shit. I know a lot of people who are really intelligent who simply weren't able to graduate high school or chose not to go to college, and I just think that education should never be gatekept, and the experience of college is sort of gatekept because it's very much something that you have to go through to fully get a sense of it. And so what I'm just going to be trying to do here is bringing that to you, if that makes sense. So that's all I really want to say for the beginning of this. Welcome. And if you swore that you would never touch philosophy with a 20-foot pole, I commend you for getting this far. Thank you so much for sitting through this. Fair warning, this first episode was basically me feeling around and trying to make an easily accessible product. The second episode is where things start to get a bit more complex because I'll be getting deep into the literature, much deeper than I'm going to be doing here, and naming a lot of names and connecting a lot of dots. Again, all of this should make sense by the third episode. If you want to access the original file for the video essay that inspired all of this, the link should be in the bio. And if you want to just listen to the audio, that should be at the beginning of this podcast. It is the first upload. So before we get into this, I would like to comment briefly on current events, seeing as it kind of concerns people who have philosophy degrees specifically and want to provide an educational service to the public. There is a YouTube channel called PhilosophyTube that posts content purportedly to teach people more about philosophy and other things. The purpose seems very similar to what I am trying to do here by giving y'all scholarly perspectives, names to research, interpretations of anime and philosophy, either from other people or myself, etc. ad nauseum. However, PhilosophyTube recently released a video that was titled, "Was Nietzsche Woke?" And it was not well received. I myself watched it and I was I didn't like it. So I am all about applying old things to the new, applying philosophy to new concepts. But I think there's an issue with the way they decided to do this particular thing. Like, I think they thought that, like, oh, well, is Nietzsche woke would be like a nice, cute little thing that people would enjoy watching. But it wasn't enjoyable at all. Probably because this question hinges on, once again, anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism, and it's a very old hat for Nietzsche. So personally, one of the reasons I don't like this is because a lot of people have argued, oh, well, he actually was pro-Jewish people. He was actually an anti-Semite, and the Nazis argued over this too. Like, it's been a thing since Nietzsche was alive. And so it's a form of sensationalizing this philosopher who, in truth, probably didn't give that much of a shit. If you actually like read about his life, he was sick most of the time. He had to move out to the mountains because he literally could not stand public life. After a while, he could not function in like polite society because he was like constantly throwing up. He was just always like in a bad place. So to me, Nietzsche is a fragile figure in time. It's not so much the problem of talking about, is Nietzsche woke? Like, this is a fun little idea. It's mainly the focus on Nietzsche because of this problem of like, oh, we have to decide whether or not he was anti-Semitic. What I mean by this is that she satirizes the whole thing in a way that it is a little too jokey to the point where it undercuts the good things she's actually saying and makes people forget the content. Like, I literally could not like focus on most of what she was saying because it was just joke after joke after joke. And then there is a clip circulating where she's like, "Oh, was the slavery? It was slavery like a real thing? Did he actually mean that? Like as a moment in time?" And I understood that it was a joke. She was trying to be funny here. It was like this really dry humor that she was trying to adopt, and people took her seriously because you couldn't tell that it was a joke. She kept basically grabbing you, then losing you, grabbing you, then losing you, because seriousness in it that was present, where she was actually saying like meaningful things. For example, that anti-Semitism was a specific political movement, not so much just anti-Judaism. So overall, I just think there was a better way to deliver a lot of the content that she wrote. So while I agree that Nietzsche is probably the best guy to explore wokeness with, I think it's unfair to him. One thing that we as a society need to practice more is temporarily ignoring most of the cultural contexts of a piece of literature until we have analyzed the thing itself, except for those details that we need to understand it. So if we want to think about Nietzsche being anti-Semitic or being anti-Jewish, we have to understand that he is operating in a time frame where there's a lot of his peers who believe stuff like this. And so regardless of whether or not you like it, they are rubbing off on him, right? So it doesn't matter whether or not he really cares about it. It's going to show up in his work. And it does. You see anti-Jewish things throughout his work. But one of the keys here to understanding Nietzsche is just that anti-Judaism isn't integral to understanding his work. And so it's just not that interesting of a question whether or not he was woke or not. That's not important to Nietzsche. Now, when I say that Nietzsche's anti-Judaism doesn't matter to him, I should also say that I don't think it's complete metaphor when he talks about Christianity and Judaism corrupting people. The genealogy of morals, which Philosophy Tube mentioned, is where all of this mostly comes up, but he's not talking about anything in terms of eugenics. He's talking about the degradation of society, morals, human behavior. He is talking, to quote him directly, about the genealogy of our moral prejudices. That is to say, the history of moral prejudices. His polemic is about how morality is developed. It is not about any one political entity or what we should really do so much as it is telling us what happened. Now, you may read his work and think, this shit is wild. I don't think any of this is true. But it's not really a work that harms anyone unless you are taking it to mean something beyond its original purpose. So if we really want to teach people about philosophy, about different philosophers, we need to actually give them our time in a respectful manner. So really fast, I am going to tell you guys a little bit about Nietzsche, primarily because he has a teensy bit to do with the episode today. Since we're going to be talking about existentialism primarily throughout this particular episode, Nietzsche is a predecessor to existentialism, and so I think that would be helpful. When I think about Nietzsche, I see in my head a very famous painting by Caspar David Friedrich called Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. It depicts a man standing at the top of a mountain, gazing out at, you guessed it, a sea of fog. The painting is considered to be a visual depiction of the Romantic era, which celebrated, to quote Britannica, the individual, the subjective, the irrational, the imaginative, the personal, the spontaneous, the emotional, the visionary, and the transcendental. It was a rejection of Enlightenment ideals and physical materialism. Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog was painted in 1818. Nietzsche was born in 1844, right smack dab in the middle of Romanticism's peak. The first book I ever read by Nietzsche was The Birth of Tragedy, which was also Nietzsche's first published work. It was then that I realized why Nietzsche was so well known even in pop culture. His words flow and blossom across the page. Truthfully, I believe that Nietzsche's style of writing has something to do with his physical and mental health, but it is beautiful. The only way I can really describe it is to refer to a treatise written in 1756-57 titled A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful. This work was written around the beginning of the Romantic era, which perhaps explains why I think of it when I think of Nietzsche. The way Burke talks about being transported from one emotion to another is reminiscent of Nietzsche because we see this rejection of rationalism present in both authors' thoughts. Both men speak about emotion, about how certain things make us feel. And I think it's important for our understanding of Nietzsche to recognize that in order to talk about drama, you must be able to see yourself as the actor. To quote Burke, we see with pity even distresses which we would accept in the place of our own. Both men, though they had radically different political views, Burke defended minorities, Nietzsche was actually pro-slavery, Burke praised Christianity, Nietzsche railed against it, were passionate about what they had to say and expressed their philosophy using passion as a vehicle to talk about things like pain and pleasure. As Coleridge said of Burke, no man was ever more like himself. And I think you could apply that statement to Nietzsche too. It wasn't just the way they talked, it was praxis. They're trying to move you so that you feel what they feel. Now, the reason I think of Friedrich's painting is because Nietzsche always felt best when he was walking, preferably climbing a mountain. As Friedrich Gross writes in The Philosophy of Walking, page 17, thus walking, looking down on the world and men, he composed in the open air, imagined, discovered, grew excited, was frightened by what he found, astonished and gripped by what came to him on his walks. The intensity of my feelings makes me laugh and shiver at the same time. It has happened several times that I have been unable to leave my room for the ridiculous reason that my eyes were red. And for what cause? Just on that previous day, during my long walks, I had wept too much, and not sentimental tears, but tears of happiness, singing and staggering, taken over by a new gaze that marks my privilege over the men of today. Nietzsche became increasingly unwell over the years after his seclusion from proper society, and was prone to euphoric madness. He eventually moved back in with his mother, and paralysis and stupidity overtook him. He barely spoke. Nietzsche died on August 25th, 1900. In preparation for this episode, I created a timeline that was originally taken from timetoast.com, and then I added to it. I will be scanning through a copy of the timeline so that y'all can see it. It's going to be in the bibliography thing that I post after the third episode. I just drew it by hand because it was going to take me less time to do it that way rather than like messing around with a program that I don't know how to use. I have put Nietzsche on here to contextualize him in relation to the main players in existentialism. I also added a note at the top that explains that Impressionism began in the 1860s. It gained gradual recognition over time and then took off in 1927. Under that is a note stating that Surrealism began in 1917, 1929. 1917 is the year we first get the use of the word surrealism by Apollinaire. And then in 1929, we get the second version of the Surrealist Manifesto, which really kicks off the movement. The timeline that I've created starts with Heinrich von Kleist's death in 1811 because I wanted to identify him as influencing existentialism indirectly. Kleist was a short story writer who heavily influenced Kafka, and I definitely recommend reading his work. Following Kleist, we have the birth of Kierkegaard in 1813, the birth of Dostoevsky in 1821, the birth of Nietzsche in 1844, and the birth of Husserl in 1859. Both Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky are inspirations to the existentialists, but they are not existentialists. The most important publications by these authors are listed Either or and Fear and Trembling by Kierkegaard and Notes from the Underground by Dostoevsky. Notes from the Underground, by the way, is one of my favorite texts. Husserl is technically an existentialist, but some people believe he doesn't count, mainly because he's not French and doesn't work in the tradition. But his phenomenology is incredibly important to the development of existentialist thought. Next on the timeline is Kafka, born in 1883. Kafka was not an existentialist either, but he did influence existentialism. In fact, one of the essays I read by Merleau-Ponty for this episode mentions Kafka. 1889, we have Heidegger, who is the reason existentialism exists the particular way it does. This is because Sartre, our leading man, who invented existentialism, was heavily influenced by Heidegger's work while he was studying in Germany. Specifically, Heidegger's Being and Time was significant. 1901, Lacan, who's called the French Freud, is born. Sartre is born in 1905, Simone de Beauvoir and Merleau-Ponty in 1908, and Camus in 1913. So now we have the main existentialist crew, Sartre, Beauvoir, Merleau-Ponty, and Camus. I've added Lacan in here, not because he's an existentialist per se, but because a lot of his psychoanalytic theory is clearly influenced by existentialism. I'm really excited to talk about Lacan in later episodes because he's absolutely my favorite, but I will not say any more on that because I don't want to spoil it. I have also put Franz Fanon on here, born 1925, who doesn't usually make it into the canon, but when I took existentialism in college, my professor had us read Fanon, specifically Black Skin, White Masks, but all of his theory pretty much takes from existentialist thought. I also put in the publications of the first and second Surrealist manifestos on here because I believe that Surrealism and Impressionism and even Dada had some influence on existentialism and vice versa. I also marked the death of Gertrude Stein because I wanted to show that she was writing during this time and died shortly after the publication of the existentialist paper, Le Temps Moderne. Stein was incredibly influential in the Paris art scene and encouraged writers and artists alike to produce more work. Now, Gertrude Stein is a great example of how a lot of the ideas in Surrealism, Impressionism, and Existentialism overlapped. While Stein was studying under William James at Radcliffe College, she was taught automatic writing. And she personally used this in her writing later in her life, all throughout her life, and developed it over time, but she called her version of it an excess of consciousness. But in Surrealism, too, the practice of automatic writing was really important. They adopted it totally on their own, nothing to do with her, because the idea was that the human body, in a state where one was not totally aware, could access hidden realities or hidden meanings. But Stein was not a surrealist. Like I just said, it didn't really have anything to do with her. Stein was an experimentalist who spent a lot of time around artists like Daumier and Cézanne, Matisse, Picasso. These artists weren't surrealists either, I'm sure you know. Daumier, for example, is probably most well known for his caricature of King Louis Philippe titled Gargantua. Matisse, for example, was considered a Fauvist until his introduction to Vincent van Gogh's work, and his style changed completely. And this is how art works. Artists work in different styles and they influence each other. They can be inspired by poetry and prose, and they can be inspired by music. Philosophy is not immune to this kind of inspiration. If we want to return to the early life of Nietzsche, for example, you will find that not only was he heavily inspired by Wagner, but that he was also an amateur composer. I think it would be absurd to say that music did not influence Nietzsche's writing. Hence, I think it is not absurd to imagine that culture in France influenced the development of existentialism as well. So the fact that Surrealism and Impressionism was happening around the same time as existentialism is not a coincidence in the slightest. Thank you, Industrial Revolution. So we have the most important books here: Being in Time, Sartre's Nausea, Camus' The Stranger, and the Myth of Sisyphus, Beauvoir's Second Sex, and Sartre's Being and Nothingness. So let's start with Being in Time. Heidegger is concerned with the question of being. What is the meaning, sense, of being? He bases this on what he calls the Greeks' initial contributions towards an interpretation of being. Heidegger thinks that being resists every attempt at definition. That's a quote. And so ontology itself has not been properly explored since Aristotle, if Aristotle even explored it properly. Throughout the first section of this work, he quotes classic scholars in order to establish a few things about being. So you kind of need to know the Greek and Latin here, but basically what he's doing is explicating what being is and is not. For example, on page 23, he cites what is called the genus differentia definition, definito fit per genus proximum et differentiam specificam, which is a particular way of categorizing creatures biologically. He wants to say that being is indefinable, which makes the question of what being is all the more important. He also thinks that we do live in, that's a quote as well, some kind of understanding of being, but that we don't understand it fully, and that this is, again, what makes the question necessary. Being is translated from the German Sein. However, Heidegger differentiates being as its own thing. What I mean by this is that the German word Siendes is used regularly. To follow the footnote on page 22, written by the translators, the substantive das Siende is derived from the participle siend, and means literally that which is. Ein Siendes means something which is. The translators state that they want to translate Siendes as entity or entities, who differentiate it from the word being or beings. Entity in this reading thus should be understood as something which is. As we see pretty quickly, page 26, quote, the being of entities is not itself an entity. And he goes on to say something really interesting here. If we are to understand the problem of being, our first philosophical step consists in not mython tina digesthei, which is myth-telling, in not telling a story, that is to say, in not defining entities as entities by tracing them back in their origin to some other entities, as if being had the character of some possible entity. Hence, being, as that which is asked about, must be exhibited in a way of its own, essentially different from the way in which entities are discovered. And I really love what he says after that, but all that's really important to mention to y'all is the part where he says, insofar as being constitutes what is asked about, and being, quote, means the being of entities, then entities themselves turn out to be what is interrogated. So you see how he's like making a distinction between being and entities, and the translators are making sure to like make that clear. Meaning that being as an entity must be in some way accessible, and ultimately this requires us to be totally transparent about how we're going about understanding being. He worries, however, that there is a circularity to this, given that how we understand being up to this point is that it is something in itself and presupposes all explanation. It presupposes things that we know about being. Quote, this presupposing of being has rather the character of taking a look beforehand. Now, this particular section is where we first get the word Dasein. They leave Dasein largely untranslated because honestly, it's iconic, and so some people who haven't even read any philosophy know of it. However, there are a few moments throughout the book where Heidegger himself breaks Dasein with a hyphen, and so these moments are considered significant enough to where the word ought to be identified through its translation as being there. As an aside, anyone who knows anything about German should understand the significance of pulling a word apart just to put it back together again. I like to think of it as like an accordion, like doing the little music thing, or like a pop-up paper house. So if you ever want a single word for a concept that's lengthy to describe, rest assured German probably has a word for it. This is called compounding, and it's where you combine multiple words to create a much longer word, which gives the word a new sense. German is also a very literal or precise language. For both of these reasons, German is excellent for doing philosophy because you can be very exact about what you mean. Point being, when Dasein gets pulled apart, it's for a very good reason. So what is Dasein? Translated literally, it is a being there in time and space. Heidegger wants to situate Dasein in the world by describing what a being is, what worldhood is, the spatiality of Dasein, and he also wants to make sure to show how what he said about being is different from Descartes' ontology. Heidegger is specifically rejecting Descartes, which is a thing that Merleau-Ponty does too, and Sartre. So it means they're rejecting the idea that the mind and body is uniquely separate, so being is divided. But they're also rejecting Descartes' understanding of consciousness itself. Another thing that Heidegger is concerned with is logos, which, if you already listened to the second episode, is unique to Greek thinkers, specifically Plato and Aristotle. And Heidegger thinks that truth doesn't just come out of logos, it comes out of something else, which of course is being. And we're going to examine that in the third episode. So page 63, 64 of Being in Time, Heidegger explains how he's going to approach these problems. And I'm just going to read this so we have this set up for when I talk about being in time more in episode 3. I also think that he dallies on the actual act of explaining Dasein because he's trying to build up to it, but I think, and he's also every sentence he's like kind of saying a little bit of something different, and like this is the problem with German philosophers, but I think we get a basic sense of what it is here. Okay, so this is labeled Design of the Treatise. The question of the meaning of being is the most universal and the emptiest of questions, but at the same time, it is possible to individualize it very precisely for any particular Dasein. If we are to arrive at the basic concept of being and to outline the ontological conceptions which it requires and the variations which it necessarily undergoes, we need a clue which is concrete. We shall proceed towards the concept of being by way of an interpretation of a certain special entity, Dasein, in which we shall arrive at the horizon for the understanding of being and for the possibility of interpreting it. The universality of the concept of being is not belied by the relatively special character of our investigation. But this very entity, Dasein, is in itself historical, so that its own most ontological elucidation necessarily becomes and historiological interpretation. Accordingly, our treatment of the question of being branches out into two distinct tasks, and our treatise will thus have two parts. Part 1. The interpretation of Dasein in terms of temporality and the explication of time as the transcendental horizon for the question of being. Part 2. Basic features of a phenomenological destruction of the history of ontology with the problematic of temporality as our clue. Turn the page. Part 1 has 3 divisions. 1. The preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein. 2. Dasein and temporality. 3. Time and being. Part 2 likewise has 3 divisions. 1. Kant's doctrine of schematism and time as a preliminary stage in a problematic of temporality. 2. The ontological foundation of Descartes' cogito sum and how the medieval ontology has been taken over into the problematic of the res cogitans. 3. Aristotle's essay on time as providing a way of discriminating the phenomenal basis and the limits of ancient ontology. And there's a little footnote here that says Part 2 and the third division of Part 1 have never appeared. So, I don't know if y'all knew this, but Being in Time is not a complete work. Be that as it may, we carry on with what we do have. Dasein is essentially rooted in historicity, but not its history. This is what makes each being in the world, so like you and me, unique, and he's going to describe this later in a number of ways. The invention of the word Dasein is him showing that being isn't enough to describe what it is like to be a person. It's going to get more complicated for him, but this is the main thing we need to know about Dasein for our purposes. Dasein is characterized by its temporality, by its being a part of time, and we, as Dasein, are aware of our existence, unlike other animals. We know who, what, when, how we are, even if we are not well able to describe it. So this is what he means by the entities themselves turn out to be what is interrogated, quote. Basically, all of that, all of the description about entities is specifically articulating what I'm saying right now. To reference my old professor's book, unlike those things that simply are, we have the capacity to notice that we are and how we are. Although traditionally this capacity has been conceptualized as our capacity for self-consciousness, Heidegger avoided this expression because he believed that thinking in terms of it inevitably led to two of the fundamental questions that Western philosophy never seemed able to answer. These were whether we could have knowledge of a world external to our own selves, skepticism about external reality, and whether we have an adequate basis for attributing minds to the bodies we see all around us, skepticism about other minds. By avoiding such dualism as self and world and mind and body, Heidegger thought that Western philosophy could move beyond the insoluble problems that plagued it, and that's pages 16 and 17. To refer back to when I was talking about German language, this is the reason we have a specific compound word for being. Further, on that note, language influences culture, and to that end, philosophy and culture, which philosophy is developed within, like Dante's Circles of Hell, influences language. And I'm going to show you what I mean by this. There is another book I've been reading called Asperger's Children by Edith Schaeffer. One thing that I came across while reading was the term Gemüt with the umlaut, and I think we should understand Heidegger's conception of Dasein partially in relation to it. Gemüt was a word specific to German culture that is not translatable to other languages. Gemüt involves, quote, the feeling of inwardness of the soul with which the German man experiences himself and his entire being rooted deeply in his racial feelings and values. And I'm just going to read from pages 69 and 70 of the book because I think she explains it really well. Nazi child psychiatrists use the term Gemüt to express their ideas of social feeling. Gemüt is one of the German language's famously untranslatable words, and its meaning changed dramatically over time. For Nazi thinkers, Gemüt referred to one's fundamental capacity to form deep bonds with other people. It had metaphysical and social connotations. Good Gemüt was essential to one's worth as an individual and to the health of the Volk. The term Gemüt emerged in the 18th century as synonymous with the soul or Seele. As ideas of the soul secularized and people paid increasing attention to personal emotions, Gemüt became a favored term in German culture. Philosopher Immanuel Kant saw Gemüt as the seat of one's transcendental faculties, animated by Geist or spirit. In the Romantic period, Gemüt became the innermost layer of the soul, more elemental, emotional, and irrational than one's Geist. Music, in particular, was supposed to stir one's Gemüt. It was such a popular trope that the venerated writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe complained in 1826. Germans should not utter the word Gemüt for 30 years. It might then regenerate itself. For the moment, it indicates merely an indulgence with weaknesses of oneself and of others. The meaning of Gemüt did indeed regenerate by the mid-19th century. In everyday conversation, it lost some of its existential and artistic flavor and became more about positive personal and social emotions. Having Gemüt meant possessing a rich internal life, strong bonds with family and friends, and a warm and friendly temperament. With the common usage of gemütlich, cozy or homey, it also encompassed casual, everyday sociability. But in philosophy, the arts, literature, and other intellectual fields, it retained more metaphysical connotations. While working in Leipzig, Asperger became particularly enamored of the Leipzig school of holistic psychology, which focused on individuals' Ganzheit, or wholeness. Crucial to their characterology was Gemüt, which signified an all-encompassing quality that connected feelings, experience, consciousness, and character. One's Gemüt reflected the value of one's self. Indeed, when Felix Kruger, one of the leaders of the Leipzig School, became chair of the German Society for Psychology in 1933, its first address praised Hitler's depth of Gemüt, Gemütstief. Likewise, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels swooned over Hitler's wonderful vigor, his verve, his zeal, his German Gemüt. So, we know now that Heidegger was a Nazi party member. And it's possible that his theory of Dasein is partially rooted in German nationalism and this idea of the uniqueness of experience of the soul, because this is how Germans thought about themselves. The very fact that they even have a word for this kind of inwardness is just really fascinating. So what I want to say is that it is likely that Heidegger's Dasein specifically comes from his being German, and so existentialism needed German culture to develop it all. Which doesn't really matter, I just think it's really interesting, and I think it's a good way of contextualizing Dasein. So now that we know a little bit about Heidegger's work, let's talk about Sartre. In Sartre's early years of study, it's documented that he first became fascinated with Husserl before he became fascinated with Heidegger. Since Heidegger was a student of Husserl, this makes sense. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Simone de Beauvoir documented one of the most famous foundational moments of existentialism, which occurred in a Parisian bar. Sartre's friend, Raymond Aron, was describing an apricot cocktail to Sartre. Sartre became fascinated with phenomenology from that point on, as well as the originality and the novelty of Husserl's method. You see, Sartre was interested at this point in explaining life exactly how he saw it, experienced it, and he wanted to pull philosophy out of it. This is apparently why he went to study in Berlin a year later. So this is where we get Sartre's early approach to what would later evolve into existentialism. Sartre wrote an article titled Intentionality, a fundamental idea of Husserl's phenomenology in 1933, where he argues that consciousness is defined by its need to perceive in order to exist. Sartre concludes that our subjective experiences do in fact say something about the world around us. Quote, "If we love a woman, it is because she is lovable. We discover ourselves by experiencing other things because we are naturally predisposed to seek ourselves out." If you read this article, you'll see that he's referencing both Husserl and Heidegger. He's already combining his ideas with theirs. Then, in 1936, we get a paper that's about 133 pages long, so like a small book, called Transcendence of the Ego, which is considered Sartre's first serious contribution to philosophy. Basically, the main point of this essay is to differentiate between two types of consciousness. One, a reflexive consciousness, and two, a pre-reflexive consciousness. Pre-reflexive is immediate and non-cognitive awareness versus the intentional consciousness he argues we have. Reflexive consciousness enables us to access pre-reflexive consciousness by virtue of intentional outside the self experience, which allows access to one's ego. To quote the SCP, the ego is the specific object that intentional consciousness is directed upon when performing reflection, an object that consciousness posits and grasps in the same act. The ego is consequently outside the self because it needs the exterior world in order to access it, which obviously is building off his previous paper. By the way, I'm not adding these two papers to the timeline despite their significance because neither of these essays are considered existentialist canon, if you will. These are essays where he's coming up with the preliminary ideas that he's going to take into existentialism later, but then there's also the other fact of, which is the same with Simone de Beauvoir. For example, her ethics of ambiguity isn't usually like mentioned when you're studying existentialism because it's kind of like extra in addition to the second sex, which is a much more important text. So being in nothingness is the most important text for Sartre, so we're going to focus on that. So Sartre, like Husserl and Heidegger, has the starting point in Cartesianism, but wants to separate himself from it. He makes a distinction in being and nothingness between being in itself and being for itself. The supposed difference between these two versions of being are linked to his idea of consciousness. The difference, as we would expect with someone whose influence is Heidegger, is a temporal one, and it has to do with freedom. Sartre's first task is to prove that the dualism of Descartes isn't necessary. There is no such thing as the mind-body problem. Quote, there is no longer an exterior for the existent if one means by that a superficial covering which hides from sight the true nature of the object. And this true nature, in turn, if it is to be the secret reality of the thing, which one can have a presentiment of, or which one can suppose but can never reach because it is the interior of the object under consideration, this nature no longer exists. The appearances which manifest the existent are neither interior nor exterior. They are all equal. They all refer to other appearances, and none of them is privileged. Force, for example, is not a metaphysical conatus of an unknown kind which hides behind its effects, accelerations, deviations, etc. It is the totality of these effects. Similarly, an electric current does not have a secret reverse side. It is nothing but the totality of the physical-chemical actions which manifest it: electrolysis, the incandescent of a carbon filament, the displacement of the needle of a galvanometer, etc. None of these actions alone is sufficient to reveal it, but no action indicates anything which is behind itself. It indicates only itself and the total series. This is literally from page 1, and the behind itself quote is really important for something he's going to argue later. Specifically, that Descartes' belief in a controlling Christian God means that everyone was endowed with meaning and purpose before being born. That is, we have no free will because it's all been determined. Sartre thinks, though, that existence should precede essence, that the reason we are where we find our meaning is in the moment. Sure, time is indefinable, but before all else, it is considered a succession, which can be understood to be seeking a before and an after. Before and after as concepts may be static, but the rest is not. And since the rest is difficult, if not impossible, to grasp, then the thing that defines temporality is the only thing that is indivisible and non-temporal: the moment where you live. Quote, the unity of this crumbling, the temporal atom, will be the instant which has its place before certain determined instances and after other instants, without admitting either before or after inside its own form. And so, our way of being is characterized by what we choose now, by our attitude towards the pattern of choices we make. What I mean by this is that we all have a unique approach to the world around us, to the things we experience, and from there a pattern emerges from the things we have chosen previously to do. And so nothing but our attitude now can define the future. We must hurl ourselves into a future we want. This is your essence. This is your brute existence. What Sartre calls facticity. I'm just going to put a break here and say that I mispronounced some things in these two quotes that I just stated. First of all, I said none of these actions. It should have been no one of these actions. And then later I said instances rather than instants. So there you are. There you have it. Apologies. I just woke up a few hours ago and I'm still not fully awake. So what makes our freedom particularly unique compared to, say, a tree or a chair? By the way, animals are slightly more tricky. There's a really great article I found called Facing the Animal in Sartre and Levinas, which I put a free link to in the bibliography if you want to explore it. I would recommend it. It's a really good article. It's simple to read. So, taking from Heidegger, Sartre makes a distinction between being a being that is for oneself versus being a being that possesses a quality in itself. To quote my professor's book, a being for itself is different from a being in itself. Rocks have to fall. They have no choice in the matter. In contrast, beings for themselves must make choices, but the outcome of those choices is not determined by anything. A for itself consciousness is a nothing. Ornberg goes on to say that to be called a nothing would be a compliment to Sartre. He thinks that humans have the freedom to do whatever they want. They don't have to become anything. I don't have to be writing this podcast right now, for example, but I chose to. That's one of the primary beliefs that the existentialist possesses about human nature, that man is free if only he would let himself be so. If you've read Nausea, Sartre's experiential work of existentialism, you'll see that he examines all aspects of what he believes the existential experience is over the course of the novel, and that this is a point that he tries to make very clear throughout the plot. So, when we're talking about being, freedom of being, and these two things is role and identity, Sartre thinks that we have a couple of additional things to establish. Sartre believes that there are certain emotions elicited from man when he has certain experiences, and that these are less emotions and more like modes of being. They are a feature of human experience itself. He thinks that these modes are integral to man understanding himself better, which is perhaps why we focus on certain objects or things. These things have to be realized by us, because we require certain emotions or modes to be elicited. Quote, the world of our desires, our needs, and our acts appears as if it were furrowed with strict and narrow paths which lead to one or the other determined end, that is, to the appearance of a created object. These modes are the following: forlornness, which comes from our awareness of God's non existence; despair, which is the awareness that we cannot control the actions of others; and shame, which is the awareness of being perceived by others as objects of experience. Finally, the most important of these modes is anguish or anxiety, which Sartre interprets as being generated from our awareness of our own freedom. When we experience anxiety, man comes closer to accessing his deepest individual potential. And when we avoid things like anxiety, we avoid ourselves. That is, we live inauthentically. We live in what the existentialist calls bad faith. Anxiety is specifically related to the concept of the absurd, that classic feature of existentialism that everybody is very familiar with. Now, the absurd we're interested in is specifically explicated by Camus. Camus rejected the idea that he was an existentialist, but his thought heavily aligns with them because he used to hang out with them until finally one day he had a break with the group. But his version of the absurd, promoted specifically by The Stranger, matches existentialist thought best, as it led to the work of Samuel Beckett. And that's how we ended up with probably the most famous existentialist play, other than No Exit, called Waiting for Godot. Camus' idea of the absurd was that the world is separate from the human experience. Nature has a peculiar way of doing things, but it is neither irrational or rational. It just simply is. Absurdity arises when we try to make sense of the world around us. We want things to match how we think, to be ordered, to be lawful or not. We want to prescribe a diagnosis for the world around us. We project our need to find meaning. But the world has no stake in this, and so we get confused, we get upset, we become troubled. Camus' reasoning ultimately derives from Kierkegaard's rejection of Hegel's determination that the world is becoming increasingly rational over time. Kierkegaard claimed that his own religion and faith was absurd, but something that he nevertheless held to. In a romantic fashion, as in Romanticism, he held that a person's individual relationship with God was what counted. This brings us to the final thing we're going to talk about before we get into the anime: others and othering. Since Sartre's conception is that we must view and experience things in order to understand ourselves and our place in the world, there's a particular thing that he thinks happens when we view other people. In literature, the classic portrayal of jealousy is Shakespeare's Othello. Iago suggests to Othello, a much acclaimed general and warrior, that his wife Desdemona is having an affair with Cassio, one of his lieutenants. Once Othello hears Iago's suggestion, he is completely possessed by the jealousy it arouses, and his entire world becomes oriented around that emotion. Every object becomes a sign he tries to interpret in order to confirm his suspicions. So a misplaced handkerchief tragically becomes a sign of betrayal. Othello is so dominated by his jealousy that it permeates everything he sees. His world becomes a projection of his jealousy, with, of course, devastating results. How does this bear on the question of the existence of others? Sartre asks us to imagine a person who, like Othello, is completely overcome with jealousy. Because he is worried that his lover is betraying him, he behaves in a way that we recognize as symptoms of jealousy. He paces the floor nervously, wondering where his lover is. He then decides that he needs to know what is happening, so he peeks through the keyhole of the door to his lover's room in an attempt to see if she is being unfaithful. Like Othello, while the lover is possessed by jealousy, his entire world is oriented around that emotion. Various things that he sees, like, say, a discarded blouse, become indications of unfaithfulness. His emotion colors his whole world by providing the interpretive framework within which everything he sees is placed. Suddenly, the lover peeking through the keyhole hears a footstep. There must be someone coming down the hall. They'll see me. Oh no, what will they think of me? They won't understand why I'm here. I look so foolish, face pressed to the door. What can I do? These are the sorts of thoughts we can imagine the jealous lover having. Sartre's startling claim is that we have just witnessed a radical transformation in the lover's existence as a result of his presumption that the footsteps he hears indicate that he has been seen. Instead of inhabiting a world of which he is the origin, as he did when he was consumed by jealousy, for he took everything as signs to confirm his own emotion, he now exists within a world whose origin is that other who is looking at him. That is, at least in his imagination, the man now sees himself as the other would see him, just as one of an entire ensemble of beings in that other's world. The other is, as an independent being, the source of his own world, and so the lover is consigned to a position within that world. He becomes just another thing in that other's world. Not only has his existence been stolen by the other, but he himself has been reduced to the status of a mere object in that other's world. Thus, in this way, he is subject to a double objectification or reification. The precise way in which the lover responds to the presence of the other is not important. He might experience very different emotions, such as embarrassment or anger, depending on his situation. What is significant, however, is that he no longer exists as he did previously, for his awareness of being seen changes the nature of his existence. He becomes aware of the existence of the other as the bearer of what Sartre calls the look. Although we first encounter other people as elements of our world, this experience of assuming that we are being observed by another brings forth another dimension. I lose both my world and also myself when I encounter the other. It does not matter if the lover is mistaken about the presence of another's consciousness perceiving him. So, this idea that others can be a threat to our existence can be traced back to Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit, where he claims that conflict between people has certain outcomes that change the way people are in the world. The human spirit seeks to know itself and obtain a kind of autonomy through interaction with the world. Heidegger, also taking from this same theme, calls the self that emerges from our encounters with others as a they self. The idea being that you become a different version of yourself when confronted by the existence of other existences. Now that all of this has been set up, I think we are ready to talk about angels of death. Bear in mind, there are a lot of things I did not discuss or mention because it's philosophy. It's complicated. There's always more to talk about. That being said, I will mention Samuel Beckett later, so just make note of that. Angels of Death is a classic tale of an amnesiac thrown into a situation that she doesn't know how to handle. It was originally conceived as a video game by creator Makoto Sanada, who also developed the cult classic Forest of Drizzling Rain, which for me was a much easier game to play, though I still managed to get the worst possible ending. Rachel Gardner is a young girl with blonde hair, blue eyes, and no memory. Just like a nun, she comes to her senses in a room all alone, a fake glowing moon shining on her through a massive window. She stumbles to her feet and makes her way into a hallway to try and figure out where she is, saying she needs to go find her parents. As soon as she opens the door, she knows she is no longer in the hospital she remembers going to. The ceiling is lined with cameras pointing in all directions, lest they miss a viewpoint. Rachel sees a message on the wall of the hallway and goes to read it. It states the following: "Who really are you? You should ask yourself. Who am I? The real myself or the one I believe to be? An angel or a sacrifice? Know yourself and new doors will open." Now, these lines are pretty straightforward for what you'd expect to appear in a horror video game. The game has already set its precedent that it's going to be about finding yours or Rachel's own story. It's going to be at least slightly scary, and that last line, "know yourself and new doors will open," is the game being self-referential. You have to remember that this story is characterized by its original basis as an RPG. So you, the player, are assuming the role of Rachel, which is made easier for you by the fact that neither of you know who you are or what's happening. This is a way that Sanada could make the game more immersive, and he uses a similar technique in Forest of Drizzling Rain, where the main character knows who she is but has a past that she doesn't remember anything about. So Rachel goes through a door next to the writing on the wall. In the video game, she finds a computer and a mirror. In the anime, she finds a typewriter. I think this choice is because the anime director probably thought it would be creepier to have a typewriter produce written words by itself rather than a computer. Because a computer can have somebody on the other end, a typewriter cannot, and it adds to the unreality of the location and the mystery of the circumstances. The typewriter begins to type as she stands in front of it. It asks, "What is your name?" She responds verbally, and this is where we hear her full name for the first time. It begins to type again. "Why are you here?" She says she was at a hospital, and when she woke up, so to speak, she didn't really wake up. It was kind of like a coming to. She was here. It types again, a single word this time. "Why?" She says, "I'm not sure." It asks again, "Why?" Rachel takes a step back. And then the typewriter says something interesting. "Why are you in the hospital?" Which implies that she's still in the hospital. So I checked the manga for this, which is more accurate to the game in this particular scene, and it skips this question altogether. So the fact that this question is a part of the anime is pretty interesting to me, because if we think about the story being told through different mediums, there's a different type of staging that's happening for different types of audiences. And also part of the changes are because different people are in charge or partially in charge of telling the story. So Rachel tells the typewriter that she witnessed a murder, and that's why she ended up at the hospital. She says she wants to see her parents. In the manga and video game, the computer produces a key card at this point that allows her to access the elevator. In the anime, it just opens for her. As she enters the elevator, a voice on the overhead states that she has been designated as a sacrifice. And this part is really interesting to me because the message on the wall plus the statement from the overhead suggests that Rachel's choice to get on the elevator in the first place is the reason she is considered a sacrifice. But there's nowhere to go on that lowest floor. She doesn't have a choice to be an angel. Rachel is there because they know something she doesn't. It should be noted that the concept of choice in this story is more nuanced, even in the anime, because we have the context of the story also being a video game. As Catherine Isbitar writes in her book How Games Move Us, the protagonist of a game is often developed with the player in mind. Players control avatars that are usually designed so that the player can project themselves into the character on at least 4 different levels: visceral, cognitive, social, and fantasy. The player's prosthetic body becomes a vehicle for action, and choice often matters, even in games where choice doesn't necessarily determine the outcome. The player needs to feel like they understand what they're doing in an immersive way. The fact that a choice is implied here but not allowed is consequently a moment where the story can increase its grip on the player. The elevator appears to take her from B7 to B6, so there are 7 floors total, with 1 being the top floor. This has some significance given that Rachel will be regaining her memories later on. The doors to the elevator opens and Rachel is introduced to a place that looks like an abandoned town or city. There's trash and bugs everywhere. Windows and doors are boarded up. Rachel hears a noise. Is anyone there? No answer. She puts her hands together as if to pray and then starts to run. Blood stains the ground, which is littered with empty bags of chips and newspaper clippings about a murderer. Suddenly, Rachel sees an injured bird. The bird is white and stained with blood, unable to fly properly, which is perhaps symbolic of herself. As she reaches out to help the bird, a man wielding a scythe explodes through the doorway in front of her, crushing the bird. So Rachel starts running and finds a room with a chest that she can hide in. And this is part of the reason I can't get through Angels of Death, the video game. Can't even get started because Zach, which is the name of the man with the scythe, and we're going to find that out later, is too fast for my poor video game skills. Sanada writes in the manga that he was aware when making the game that Zach was incredibly fast, and he wanted that to be the case so that players would feel overwhelmed and afraid of him. He didn't want it to be so hard, though, that people wouldn't be able to beat Zach, but that it would be a fun challenge. But Sanada could not have possibly been prepared for how bad of a player I am. So I did not have fun. I literally gave up, but that is because I am very bad at games, not because the game design sucks. I am very uncoordinated. So anyway, if you watch the original video, you will notice that there is game footage in there, and I found that somewhere. I think it was YouTube, but I do not remember who I sourced, so now I have to go and find that person to source them. But also that video isn't technically posted anywhere, so I didn't worry about it. I was making it for me. Should have worried about it, but too late now. Yeah, so there's that. Zach is very dumb, just like me, so he does not consider opening the chest to check if she's in there. He just puts his scythe through it to see if it catches her body, and it doesn't. So she's safe for now. After he leaves, she goes running back to the bird, and here is where she gets weird. She sees the dead bird, its wing now totally torn off and its body crushed, and the sparkle in her eyes fades. She thinks, no, this one is different. This is not the same bird. It didn't look like this. So despite the fact that she's on the run from a very stupid murderer, she stops and starts to sew the bird back together. And there's some possession to this for her. This is about making the bird the way she remembers it, taking ownership for the memory of what it used to be as hers. In this moment, it's as if she's locating her ego. You've been damaged and you need to be fixed. When she's done, she starts running again. Zach's figured out where she is at this point, and so he chases her to the elevator. Onward to the next floor. Here we meet Danny, a man with a fascination for eyeballs. He is kind to Rachel at first. His tragic backstory is that his eyes barely worked, or at least one of them barely worked, and that his mother eventually hung herself, apparently because of his eye, though it was probably because of something else. Kids always blame themselves, which instigated his obsession for eyes to go into overdrive. Recall Sartre's essay on intentionality. Consciousness is defined by its need to perceive in order to exist. We find ourselves by seeing others. The theft of eyes for Danny involves a profound lack of identity as a sickness, obsession, where he is constantly seeking the eyes of his mother, staring at him with emptiness. It is a punishment for himself because he knows the projection will never last. This would be a great point in time to talk about Lacan, but like I said, I don't want to spoil him till later because I will talk way too much about him. In fact, I am considering doing 2 episodes involving him. But I do want you to know that he's applicable here, so when I talk about him later, you can imagine the lines I am drawing. So it's also possible that Danny is a figment of Rachel's imagination, and a clue to this is that he happens to possess a skill that she has, which is skill with a needle. And he's supposedly a doctor who deals with eyes, but if she's in the hospital for trauma, why would he be her doctor? As I wrote for the video I made about Angels of Death, Dani is a representation of the Doctors who, in her disjointed state, she believes aren't actually on her side. They want to know her perspective, as in they want her eyes. They want that version of whatever's wrong with her brain to become theirs, not so they can help her, but merely so they can take and possess something she treasures, which is her own sanity, which is ultimately something beautiful. Consciousness in itself. At this level in the building, we can see that regardless of whether Dani is real or not, he is nevertheless mirroring her in a way. He has the same problem with her that she has with the bird. They both want to immortalize something they find beautiful. Now, Dani gets stabbed by Zach because Zach is like, fuck this. I'm not letting this girl get away. Excuse me. And so he just goes to the second level, which is a violation of the building's rules. And it's like a whole thing. But anyway, Dani gets stabbed and Zach ends up making a pact with Rachel because she has decided by this point that she wants to die. And she asks him, hey, actually, would you mind killing me? And he's like, yeah, sure. And so she has him swear to God, and now they're a team. So okay, so this brings us to the third level. This is where we meet Eddie, who masks himself and builds gravestones for the sacrifices that make it to his level. Eddie represents Rachel's impulse to hide who she is deep down behind something more tolerable. He represents her inability to face reality and accept her behavior for what it is, a desire to possess or to fix, which perhaps is recognition that she knows that there's something broken inside of her, or perhaps even missing. Eddie claims that what he does is art in the name of beauty and fails to acknowledge that his choices are selfish. He is right when he says that Rachel really wants to die, but the reason he's right is because that's what he wants too. The part of Rachel that is Eddie knows it's easier to die than it is to understand oneself. And yet, by facing Eddie as an other, she comes closer to knowing who she is. It's also important to understand that Rachel isn't afraid of Eddie like she was Dani. She's very close to taking him up on his offer, which I think shows that she relates to him the most. Throughout the anime, Rachel references God without a real context for her doing so, to the point where you have to wonder whether or not she does actually feel guilty about something that we don't know about, and seeing as we don't know very much about her, it's very possible. But I also think in relation to her wanting to be killed, I think that that's probably because, at least in Catholicism, if you kill yourself, you can't get into heaven, right? So Eddie presents a beautiful promise to Rachel, a noble death, a way for her to be immortalized, just as one is immortalized by entering the kingdom of God. But entering the kingdom of God means that the truth would have to remain hidden, which is something she inherently knows. And while she wants to avoid the truth, she is nevertheless propelled towards it. Ultimately, Eddie's promise is too naive, too weak. Accepting his hand means accepting that God is dead. To simply die and be buried amongst the flowers would be to accept losing her God, having lost herself, and to accept a facade that promises that everything is fine. But it's not fine for Rachel. She feels she is somehow responsible for the death of God and for his, at the same time, leaving her, just as her memories and her parents have left her. Unable to accept the fate of being alone, of dying alone, she calls Zach her God. While this leads to Eddie's defeat, Rachel is still lying to herself, but it is a step up from just taking the easy way out. Rachel's lot is that you can never escape the other, no matter how much of a threat they appear to you. In the absence of the other, the mind creates others with which she might form concrete relations. Whether or not the truth is something we want to face, our consciousnesses are determined to find the self, which requires acting authentically. That means facing the parts of us that are inauthentic. We must recapture ourselves from the intervention of the other. I was about to mispronounce that. And that is why the moment we encounter the other overflows. You and the other are trying to make sense of the disconnection. As Merleau-Ponty writes, none of this takes place in some otherworldly realm, in some shrine located beyond the body of the angry man. It really is here, in this room, and in this part of the room, that the anger breaks forth. It is in the space between him and me that it unfolds. So each time Zach and Rachel meet a new character, their identity is challenged by the very existence of the challenger, not just their actions. I also think it's really important for understanding Rachel's character that we see Zach as not just a member of her team, but as the part of her that wants to fight. And so often, he is the one who ultimately confronts the other. He is not an other, he is the part of her that fights fate. When Sartre talks about anxiety or anguish, he says that part of what characterizes this anxiety is the desire to be God, the desire to be in itself for itself. We want at the same time to have control over fate, but we also want to have no fallibility as well as the ability to respond automatically in the right way, just like God. And if you notice, Zach does this naturally. He doesn't wait for anyone except Rachel, mainly because she's smarter than him and has to solve the puzzles. But in all other ways, Zach can be her god because he doesn't worry about being wrong. He doesn't worry about control. He simply takes it. That's why he leaves his floor to hunt Rachel on the second floor and ends up almost killing Danny. Zach has no god, which makes him stronger. So this is where I came up with the notion that the building is kind of like a living entity or brain, because there are two sort of protagonists that are working together to fight other people that have things in common with the main character specifically. And so it's like Rachel trying to come to terms with herself. On the next level, we meet Kathy, the prison warden, who puts Zach and Rachel through a series of trials. Kathy believes herself to represent law and order. She thinks that both Zach and Rachel need to be punished for the things that they've done wrong. Suffering looks good on you, she tells Rachel. If the viewer thought Rachel's black and white striped dress wasn't symbolic before, they know now for certain that it was intentional. However, Kathy mainly focuses on punishing Zach. She tortures him, forcing him to relive his memories. This is part of what I use as evidence to consider the building more like a whole thinking entity. I think that it's easier to understand the apparent absurdity of this world, aka brain, if we consider Zach and Rachel as two aspects of a conscious personality battling the interior of not just a psyche, but a particular psyche, which is Rachel's. Also explains the prison garb that she wears. That might be why Kathy chooses to judge Zach more harshly, because he represents the willingness to be blatantly bad, which is something Rachel currently shies away from. In this light, Zach becomes just as much the repressed side of Rachel, as Rachel represents the portion of Zach that he doesn't want to address, i.e., the portion of him that feels broken. Both of them are avoiding actually thinking about death and murder in a complete sense, which is one of the reasons they are inextricably entwined. But there's also another element to Kathy that requires knowing a little bit about Michel Foucault. Foucault is not an existentialist, but he is born in the same time frame, October 1926. Again, I'm not going to put him on the timeline because I don't want to associate him with the existentialists or any other group that I have mentioned for that matter. He published one of his most famous works called Discipline and Punish: The Birth of the Prison in 1975. In this book, he explores traditional power structures and how they evolved over time. How we once had a tendency to punish the body in specific ways as a method of control, but over time we have learned to reduce our direct contact to the body and explore psychological torture in a way that isn't really torture, but we're still punishing people through the mind. So we went from punishing people through the representative, signifying public, scenic, collective model of punishment to punishing people coercively, solitarily, and secretly. So Kathy represents Foucault's executioner, who stands, quote, as the adversary of this crime, an adversary who could show pity or ruthlessness. The executioner not only implemented the law, he also deployed the force. He was the agent of a violence applied in order to master it to the violence of the crime. And that's page 51. So one of the interesting parts about this world that they're in is that essentially all forms of punishment are present, which again, I think is good evidence of the mind knowing its crime, which is why everybody understands each other in this world, even if they don't know it yet. The cameras on the lowest floor, for example, are very much indicative of Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, which Foucault says has the effect of inducing the inmate to a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power. The goal is to scare the sacrifices to the point where they cannot think rationally through the problems set before them. But then also by forcing a sacrifice to realize why they might deserve punishment, you convince the subject to do your dirty work for you. You convince them that they deserve the punishment they're getting. Which is why Zach is an integral character to Rachel's development and getting her out alive. Because he doesn't care that he's being watched, and he doesn't care about the fact that he's killed people. Coercion doesn't work on him. Which is why Kathy targets him at this level. If surveillance doesn't work on someone like Zach, then perhaps the spectacle will. One of the trials literally involves an electric chair and a crowd of mannequins set up to laugh, sort of, at anyone who sits in the chair as they get either electrocuted or shocked. This part reminds me of Meursault's trial in Camus' The Stranger. I sat down with the policemen standing on either side of me. It was then that I noticed a row of faces in front of me. They were all looking at me. I realized that they were the jury. But I can't say what distinguished one from another. I had just one impression. I was sitting across from a row of seats on a streetcar, and all these anonymous passengers were looking over the new arrival to see if they could find something funny about him. I knew it was a silly idea since it wasn't anything funny they were after but a crime. There isn't much difference, though. In any case, that was the idea that came to me. So not only is the spectacle a part of the game, but it's used to produce an anxiety that confronts and attacks the criminal. The criminal is confronted by his oneness, faced with the judgment of the many. The final room that Kathy cloisters Zach and Rachel in is lined with machine guns. She gives Rachel a gun, and the two sacrifices are posed against one another. Zach has previously been forced to take mind-altering drugs and is struggling not to lose control. He tells Rachel not to let him kill her yet because the implication is that the drug has some kind of berserker effect and he is meant to kill with reckless abandon. Rachel knows that he's struggling and doesn't want him to make a choice he regrets. After all, without her, he won't be able to escape the building. She lowers the gun. She tells him that there is always free will. He still has a choice. Zach takes this and, in an effort to defy his own impulses, stabs himself with the scythe. This gets Kathy angry enough to leave her protective glass chamber, screaming that neither of them are her ideal criminal. She specifically dislikes Rachel because she's boring and passionless. Rachel doesn't play her game because she doesn't get riled up. Rachel attempts to point the gun at Kathy, but Kathy tells her there were no bullets in the gun. Likely because keeping Zach alive meant that she would have more fun punishing him for killing Rachel. Unfortunately for Kathy, Rachel happens to have her own gun. Faced with the possibility of losing the person who promised to kill her, she shoots Kathy. Zach manages to get back up and slices Kathy to her death. Fun little aside, right after this happens, Zach refers to Kathy as Little Miss Crime and Punishment, which is perhaps a reference to a book by Dostoevsky, the title of which is Crime and Punishment. It explores the life of an ex-law student who plans to kill someone because he convinces himself that some crimes are justifiable, but of course he feels guilty after he commits the crime. This is where that famous quote of Dostoevsky's comes from: "Your worst sin is that you have betrayed and destroyed yourself for nothing." There may be no direct connection here, but it is very likely a nod. It's also not quite evidence for the influence of existentialism, but it is very cute given that Dostoevsky influenced existentialism. When they get to the second floor, Zach is bleeding out and close to death, obviously. Rachel drags him from the elevator and leaves to seek medicine. She stops in a darkened room as candles are lit by an unseen force along the wall. She is in a room that appears to be part of a church. A candelabra topples over to light the soft red carpet on fire, and instead of smoke, Rachel is accosted by a sweet-smelling purple haze clouding her vision. The mist fades, and the room has changed completely. Directly before her is a pulpit with the following words displayed. The one God desires must be clean and devoid of falsehood. So who are you? Ask yourself that question. Are you a desirable sacrifice, or are you an angel? Or even if you are neither, if you truly hope to find God's salvation, reveal and confess all your sins. She completes reading this out for us, then walks to a piece of paper attached to a doorway. The paper asks, "What is thy name?" She answers, and the paper crumples into itself. The door opens. Purple smoke fills the candlelit hall, and at the end is a small bottle. Words scrawl themselves into existence, floating above her. Spit out your sins, and that will be your proof. What do you feel as you gaze upon the proof? The doors open so that you can know the stains you bear. The words begin to spin around her, and suddenly she stands before a mirror. Look at yourself, the words write. A sacrifice, a lost sheep, or a demon. The only thing God wants is you without lies. So there are quite a few things happening here, and as you can see, that's why I mentioned Alice in Wonderland in the initial recording. This portion of the building is quite literally smoke and mirrors. It is about illusion as a form of coercion. In my research, I wanted to explore this section in terms of Gothic-inspired video games, and I came across what appeared to be a perfect book chapter called Doppelgamers, Video Games, and Gothic Choice. However, I was not able to get access to the chapter. I would have to get a copy of the book, and I didn't have the time or money to do that. Maybe one day. So what we do have are the synopsis for the chapter. Do go read it. I'm going to put it in the bibliography, though I'm not going to reference it from now on. But just know that I looked at that and was like, this would be awesome, but I can't read it. So, and also some of the writings of Fred Botting, who is mentioned in the synopsis. Botting 2014 starts out the introduction to his book Gothic by characterizing medieval literature. He says that Gothic texts are distinctly anti-modern. They shun the comforting presence of light, which signifies rationality, security, and knowledge. These fictions are all sorts of adjectives: obscure, gloomy, abhorrent, crude. They emphasized superstition, the belief in ghosts and demons, and that psychological dependence on otherworldly things not only encouraged violence and disorientation, but encouraged instability and unease in the believer. And to quote more specifically, Gothic texts are not good in moral, aesthetic, or social terms. Their concern is with vice. Protagonists are selfish or evil. Adventures involve decadence or crime. Now, this sounds a lot like our story in general, but it also specifically sounds like this particular level. In a moment here, we're going to meet Gray, a somewhat psychotic priest. He tells Rachel that she must tear up her sins and drag them out of her. She must recover her memories in pieces in order to remake them whole. Gray is a lot like us in the moment where we meet him. He tells her, "I have yet to determine your true character. Any judgment that I could pass upon you now would be a blind one." Just as the viewer or player does not know Rachel's crime at this point, we know it must have something to do with her parents. Gray does not fully know the whole story. This is both why he is depicted as blind and why the purple gas permeating the level is psychedelic gas. Priests are not supposed to judge books by their covers, and psychedelics have a tendency to unopen people to help them discover their true self. In order to help Zach, Rachel realizes she needs to get medicine. She tells Gray that she wants to save him because of their pact. She does not intimate that she cares about him in any way. Gray tells her the only place medicine would be is on Danny's floor and agrees to help her on two conditions. 1, she only return below with him by her side, and 2, she complete a series of tests so that they may determine her personality. She consents and they travel to Kathy's floor. Her task is to turn back on the electricity. During her time running the floor, Kathy had imprisoned a lot of people, and their living corpses lived on in the cells there. zombie-like, and so barely human. Rachel is having trouble with the zombies, so when she reaches the control room, she simply guns every remaining zombie down. I'll shoot them. I have to. They shouldn't have stood in my way. Before she can leave the room, however, the ghost of Kathy appears to chastise her. I suppose the means justify the ends. You truly are the worst kind of sinner there is. When Rachel returns to Gray, she explains why she killed the zombies. They were in my way. Gray seems perturbed by this, yet they carry on to Eddie's floor. Eddie's once beautiful garden is dead. The gravestones that Zach destroyed in irritation and boredom lay scattered across the crumbling cobblestone. Gray tells Rachel once again to make it to the control room. Proceed with caution. As soon as she steps forward, a ghostly hand grabs her ankle. Mildly disgusted, she stomps on the hand and thinks, how annoying. She keeps stomping on hands until she makes it through, despite the screams of the dead. When she's completed the mission, the ghost of Eddie emerges to lecture her. That was really mean of you. You didn't even feel bad a little bit. How come you couldn't think about what would make them happy? I guess the only person you worry about is yourself. I would like to point out that this is psychological abuse. She does not have to feel bad about any of this because, there is literally nothing else she can do. She recognizes, for example, that the hands aren't real hands, they're just ghosts. So Eddie makes her feel bad for no reason. She knows that this is a test, but Gray wants to keep up the facade. All of these people were already dead or going to die fairly soon, so while it's supposed to make you think about what kind of person she is, it's also in the context of being judged by genuinely bad people. The question, of course, though, is whether or not bad people deserve kindness and care, and you're supposed to kind of figure that out on your own. They don't give us an answer. On Danny's floor, Rachel is unable to locate any medicine. Everything is gone. When she returns to the elevator to ask Gray about it, he blames her as the common denominator for everything bad that's happened in the building recently. They proceed to Zach's floor. The next part is simply backstory for Zach, and then we find out that Danny is very much alive and has found Zach on the higher level. He tries to cut a deal with Zach, telling him to bring him Rachel's eyes. We cut back to Rachel and Gray's descent to Zach's floor. Gray says that Zach's floor is like his character, simple and honest. Rachel should have no trouble finding his room. She doesn't, and she's able to find fresh bandages for him as well as his knife. She also finds paper that shows that Zach tried to teach himself how to write, as well as junk food everywhere. Rachel reflects that she doesn't really know him at all. To me, it seems like their relationship really is more than just about their pact, but you're made to question it nevertheless. They return to the second floor where they find Zach's body has vanished. Gray, once again, blames Rachel for disrupting everyone on these floors. He explains that Danny is likely alive but acting erratic. He also explains that if Rachel is totally responsible for everything negative that's happened on these floors, he will have to pass judgment upon her. Gray says that she's selfish, and we get an extreme reaction from Rachel. She says she's not being entirely selfish because Zach swore to God that he was going to kill her. I'm also helping him keep his word. Gray gets pissed at this, saying, do you claim to have divine knowledge that God would accept such a promise? Is it not up to God to determine whose promise will become reality? And if God's choice goes against your desires, Rachel Gardner, would you defy his will? Which is a really good question, honestly. We don't know anything about her yet, meaning that we don't know ourselves at all. What would the player playing as Rachel choose to do? Over the course of the gameplay, players extend themselves further into the motivations of the character and the visceral, cognitive, social, and fantastical possibilities of the avatar, forging an identification grounded in observation. But that doesn't mean we have to act as her. We have a responsibility to act however we have interpreted her. But that also doesn't mean that the player will follow what they've identified depending on the mechanics of the game, i.e. what the game allows to happen in a narrative sense. Rachel meets up with Zach finally, and they have a short discussion, wherein Zach states that Kathy was right. He is a monster. They also decide to try and find Danny, and as they're walking, Rachel asks Zach whether since he's a monster, he's human. Zach, in response, asks her whether there's anything special to being human. What makes a human? Is there something special that a human is supposed to do? Rachel reveals her personal limitation by saying, "What God wants, I guess." So, this portion prompted me to search for articles that talk post-human Gothic, because one feature of Gothic literature is the problem of the monster, specifically Shelley's monster, because Frankenstein, also called the modern Prometheus, is the text that kicked off the genre in 1818. So, I found an article titled Posthuman Monsters, which may give us somewhat of an answer as to why Rachel is so obsessed with finding God in everything. Quote, Michael Sean Bolton, in his article Monstrous Machinery Defining Posthuman Gothic, writes that in the posthuman Gothic, the terror of the threat from the outside integrates with the horror of the threat from the inside. While a sense of terror arises from the external fear of being transformed into a machine creature, a sense of horror emerges from the internal dread that the technological other already inhabits the human subject, that the subject is betrayed from within. This technological other is also referred to in the article as the monstrous other. Essentially, the posthuman Gothic focuses less on general apocalyptic destruction and more on a transformation, specifically of the body and mind. But that mental transition into a non human entity specifically sparks an internal horror rather than just terror. Terror expands the soul outward. It leads us to, or engulfs us in the sublime, the immense, the cosmic. Horror overtakes the soul from the inside. Consciousness shrinks or withers from within. He writes that posthumanism can be defined as the investigation into what, if anything, remains of the human beyond the disintegration of the liberal humanist subject in postmodernity. The source of dread in the posthuman Gothic lies not in the fear of our demise, but in the uncertainty of what we will become and what will be left of us after the change. Rachel's specific fear is becoming like the people she's surrounded by, and in that way, she literally cannot change to be like them. She avoids and rejects seeing herself as a monster because doing so in her mind means being betrayed by God. So the only solution is to seek out a narrative that treats another, who she perceives to have power, as a god. It doesn't matter to her whether Zack is a monster because it serves her purposes. One of the interesting things about this, too, is that Zack implies that he lacks agency without Rachel. For example, he says, "Don't make me do that again," or "just say the word," implying that he sees himself as a tool to be used by Rachel despite his attempts to divorce himself from the role of being a tool for others to use. Shortly after this, they're attacked by a giant snake and Zack saves Rachel. Consider being in time again, just real fast. Dasein requires us to involve ourselves with the world almost absent-mindedly, and Heidegger frames this natural kind of state as ready to hand, Zuhandenheit. Anything that is ready to hand has a worldly character to it, which means that it has an ontological relationship to the exterior world. He also thinks that being ready to hand has been discovered, so to speak, before any action takes place. So hilariously enough, when I was thinking about this, I heard the ready to pair statement that headphones will say, like, in my head when they're trying to connect to your phone. And honestly, that's kind of what ready to hand means, because it is ontologically primary to other modes, such as present to hand, which is different. Present to hand is when we look at a thing with certain detachedness without the intent to use it, perhaps because we can't physically or it's broken, like a scientist or a doctor or somebody whose job is to observe. So Heidegger's example for the ready to hand is a hammer. A hammer contains a potential to be used, so a person picks up the hammer and starts to use it systematically. After a while, he doesn't need to focus so deeply on the hammer, and he can talk with the people around him. So while the hammer completes its task, it also obscures the action one uses it for itself. So imagine a person who is so skilled at guitar that it's second nature to them. They've played for years, and so it's therapeutic to them almost to continue playing, and they don't even really notice what they're playing at times, right? That is considered an authentic display of ready to hand. So that is when a person is authentically engaging with a particular item that is usable. So out of everyone in the building, the main person who systematically utilizes a tool is Zack. You could say Eddie uses a shovel, but in reality he uses a number of tools. The shovel is merely the one we associate with him. But the story's choice to associate shovel and scythe with particular characters does in fact highlight the fact that a tool simultaneously obstructs the context of an action with the methodical practice of utilizing the tool. Like I said, it's therapeutic. When Eddie chisels his graves, there must be a kind of release to that. And for Kathy, there must be some kind of therapy in utilizing a gun, utilizing cameras. Danny's tool of choice, of course, is his eye, and there is comfort for him there. Gray has his lectionary that emits psychedelic gas. All of these items are things that can be used in ways that signify readiness to hand. Quote, the peculiarity of what is proximately ready to hand is that in its readiness to hand, it must, as it were, withdraw in order to be ready to hand quite authentically. It's also important to understand that items that are ready to hand always exist in relation to other things, as in, ready to hand always requires something else. Quote, the work is dependent on, angewiesen auf, leather, thread, needles, and the like, end quote. All of these things come from something too. Leather comes from animals, needles are metal, and that material comes from somewhere. Nature is always discovered alongside these products because nature is in them. The problem, of course, is that even when you put all these objects together, we don't have a good understanding of what the world is. Objects like this, though, produce an innate towards which, meaning that many of these things are also made to be used and are not just usable, and so they reflect something in us that identifies need. Quote, the work to be produced as the towards which of such things as the hammer, the plane, and the needle likewise has the kind of being that belongs to equipment. The shoe which is to be produced is for wearing, footgear. The clock is manufactured for telling the time. The work which we chiefly encounter in our concernful dealings, the work that is to be found when one is at work on something, das in Arbeit befindlich, has a usability which belongs to it essentially. In this usability, it lets us encounter already the towards which for which it is usable. A work that someone has ordered, das Bestellwerk, is only by reason of its use and the assignment context of entities which is discovered in using it. So let's put this in the context of video games. In Angels of Death, we control primarily Rachel, but we also occasionally control Zack. In a narrative-driven story, occasionally your identity will change, i.e., you will occasionally be given control over another character's body, but in general, there is a sense that both characters, Rachel and Zack, are ready to hand, but also that Zack is very much being used by Rachel and by the player to advance in the story. It is actually, and I wasn't going to talk about Descartes' mind-body problem in this episode, but it's literally dividing the body and the mind, Zack being the body and Rachel being the mind. So we end up with Rachel, who is distinctly not a tool because she rejects the idea, giving Zack hope that one day he will be able to realize his own agency. She rejects the nihilist conclusion. Part of his character is that he gets overtaken with the desire to kill and recognizes that his inability to control his emotions means that he lacks some level of agency that other people possess. And Rachel shows him that he does have choice. So this is like the body and mind learning to work together to become one. So to clarify, these are not characters that are present to hand, and they are not tools. They are certainly Dasein, they are beings, and they are using objects to find their true self. So if you refer back to Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit, where the spirit is consistently trying to seek the whole of itself. So my idea is that items of trauma are being used in order to recover the pieces that have been lost, and that it is a kind of a never-ending cycle, because by utilizing the piece of trauma, you do not actually access the past. So that is my idea here, though, that might sound crazy. Let's move on. Episode 10 is where Rachel is forced into a full psychedelic experience where Gray puts her on trial as a witch. The crime being that she has deceived this holy host of angels and made an ungodly pact with Zack. This scene is reminiscent of Merceau's trial as well, from The Stranger. And there you have it, gentlemen, said the prosecutor. I have retraced for you the course of events which led this man to kill with full knowledge of his actions. I stress this point, he said, for this is no ordinary murder, no thoughtless act for which you might find mitigating circumstances. This man, gentlemen, this man is intelligent. You heard him, didn't you? He knows how to answer. He knows the value of words. And no one can say that he acted without realizing what he was doing. Gray says that it isn't our job to decide what's right or wrong, but rather God's, which is awkward given that he is currently playing God here and he's the whole reason the building exists in the first place. Gray brings every other member of every floor to testify against Rachel, ghost or not. Danny, of course, is still alive and testifies last. He accuses her in a way that, again, is similar to the prosecutor in The Stranger, claiming that her soul can never be redeemed. She consumes everything she sees, he says. She's merciless, endlessly taking from the people around her in hopes of satisfying her own emptiness. All her soul can do is take. To quote The Stranger, and I tried to listen again because the prosecutor started talking about my soul. He said that he had peered into it and that he had found nothing, gentlemen of the jury. He said the truth was that I didn't have a soul and that nothing human, not one of moral principles that govern men's hearts, was within my reach. Of course, he added, we cannot blame him for this. We cannot complain that he lacks what was not in his power to acquire. But here in this court, the wholly negative virtue of tolerance must give way to the sterner but loftier virtue of justice, especially when the emptiness of a man's heart becomes, as we find it has in this man, an abyss threatening to swallow up society. And that's from page 101. Rachel's fear at God not existing is the only reason any of Gray's tactics work. He does eventually drive her to the conclusion that God is who and what we decide for ourselves, but until that point she struggles and panics over the idea that everything is meaningless without a plan. But if she hadn't been confronted by Gray regarding this notion, she could have never let the idea of an omniscient God go. This is the purpose of the other. Gray also believes himself to be God, and by the end of the witch trial, we see exactly how he's been manipulating Rachel. He's made her think up to this point that he's talking about the same God as she is, and the illusions have helped him in his psychological warfare. Rachel breaks free from his control by holding Zach's knife close, saying, I see. There is a God. He's right here with me, referring to Zach. Everything Gray says after this is futile because she no longer needs him. She doesn't have time. She has to save a life. Rachel makes it to Zach and stitches him up, allowing them to continue to the final floor. This is where Rachel's story will finally unfold for us in an honest fashion. They enter a room where two people sit on the couch, sewn together. Rachel is terrified of Zach seeing her past and having him judge her for it, to the point where she faints. Danny shows up and locks Zach out of the room so that he may stay there with Rachel. He tells Zach that he needs to learn everything about Rachel, given that he's her new god. Zach sets about angrily trying to figure out what he's supposed to do, dodging various deadly traps, until finally he falls through the floor of one of the hallways. Gray helps him out, given his soft spot for Zach. He tells Zach how to access the room he needs to go to, and Zach manages to get in. The room he enters is Rachel's room, and he has to watch the TV in there. The first thing he sees is a news channel talking about the deaths of Rachel's parents and the disturbing way in which they were found. The second thing he watches is Danny's initial interview with Rachel. We find out that Rachel has a history of killing small animals because she wants to keep them forever, and that she is also responsible for her father's murder. Granted, his murder was self-defense. She wanted the perfect family, so she stitched her parents' bodies together at the shoulders. So clearly she's fucked up, right? And we're not sure if it's because of her parents being abusive or whether it's because there's actually something wrong with her. To be fair, they are genuinely terrible people. Like, they are really shitty parents, and they are awful to one another. So I think the implication is that that's kind of why she's like that. But obviously we don't know for sure. But we find that the reason there is an entire floor that looks like Rachel's house is because Danny was so infatuated with her that he asked Gray to make her an angel on the top floor. And her being at the top floor is really important because it's a method of protection, but it also kind of means that she is sort of the last boss that people have to fight. So she's technically one of the most difficult people to fight, right? So, very few sacrifices should manage to make it up to that level, and so it preserves her purity in some way. All of her crimes at that point appeared to be born from a desire to have a functioning family and to have people treat her well. I think we can see from her behavior on the lower levels that she is genuinely a smart girl and she's not fooled by people. She understands people's cruelty, which is likely why she dissociates to this degree. The reason she ends up a sacrifice when we meet her in the beginning is because she read a Bible that was put on her floor, possibly one that used to be in her house. This is why she has repeated meltdowns about the existence of God. She needs him to be real because, unlike the other residents, she feels guilt. Zach renounces godhood, which prompts Rachel to have a breakdown and try to kill him. In the process, she also shoots Danny. You've got to remember she's only 13, so she's not exactly set on what she wants. Her entire fantasy has been blown. But despite being turned against one another, she and Zach do actually care about each other by this point. He convinces her that he's not a god and that it's literally okay. For an insane person, you're way too serious. I'm the one you can see with your eyes, so I'm the one you should believe in, he says. They remake their pact, removing the concept of God from the mix entirely. They both swear to each other this time, instead of just Zach making a promise to her. To quote the stranger again, "You always get exaggerated notions of things you don't know anything about. I was made to see that contrary to what I thought, everything was very simple." Rachel learns to take responsibility for her own actions and accept that she has sinned no matter how bad it may seem to her. She no longer seeks forgiveness. I am myself. Nothing more, nothing less. Rachel is able to direct herself and Zach to the exit, but Danny's body has disappeared yet again. As Rachel and Zach climb some very long stairs to leave the building, Danny sets the building to self-destruct. Gray wanders the crumbling fortress with a smile on his face. So I wanted to briefly mention a concept that I found while I was scrolling Instagram. There is a creator called the Metro Classic, and he talks about like a bunch of Japanese customs and like different things. But there's a video where that's called commenting on bad food, and he mentioned a concept called otona, where like basically it means maturity, and he mentions a phrase at the very end of the video, which is like, as Japanese people say, um like something about like, we climb this as we age, we climb the stairs to otona. And I was like, that's really interesting in relation to this. So I went and I tried to find like anything written about otona at all, and the only thing I found was something kind of disturbing, which is child suicide. And I was like, oh, oh no. But also may have some significance here, so I don't really know how to like put it fully into words, but just pointing that out as like an interesting interpretation of like maybe them climbing the stairs is like Rachel escaping suicide. Seems like a valid possibility. Previously, something I haven't mentioned until this point, though I did mention it in my original video, is the ongoing bit where Zach repeatedly tries to break through various iron structures. It's turned into kind of a joke between him and Rachel that he can't physically do this, but also if he tries, the scythe will break. Until finally, the joke becomes significant at the end here. As Zach and Rachel are climbing the stairs that lead to the exit of this building, their way is blocked by iron bars. Miraculously, and without his scythe breaking, Zach slices through these bars easily. The next thing that happens is also telling. The two come up against one last barrier as they're running up the stairs to freedom. The ceiling appears to have caved in. Zach asks for Rachel's permission and he'll smash the debris to bits. And of course, she gives it, and their way is free. When he destroys the rocks here, however, his scythe does break in half, suggesting that Zach's purpose was to protect Rachel the entire time. The scythe simply becomes present at hand, and Zach's job as a tool for Rachel and others is done. There is nothing to obstruct the obviousness of his freedom anymore. Rachel and Zach are finally at the doors, and this is where Danny shows up for the final time, shooting Rachel in the back and injuring Zach. He is prevented from killing Zach, too, by the priest, who we know likes Zach. This moment had me draw the conclusion that Gray's intention the entire time was to let Rachel and Zach leave. Gray shoots Danny with a crossbow, I don't know if that's meant to be a joke, allowing Zach to carry Rachel to safety. Rachel will later wake up in the hospital without Zach and will discover that he has been sentenced to death. The legacy of the murder mansion ends with Danny and Gray acknowledging reality to one another. Danny is forced to accept that he tried to give love to Rachel so that she would love him back. If Rachel isn't alone anymore, then there's nothing left that will accept the ugly thing that I am. And Gray is forced to reckon with his initial supposition that he or anyone else that he collected in those halls was special or divine. Danny, despite everything, you and I are nothing but human beings. No one who ever set foot in this building was anything but human. Humans are the ones who create God. So I'm not going to talk about the ending other than to say that Rachel and Zach get reunited, but I do want to mention this because I know some people might get upset about it. Their age difference is 13 and somewhere around 20 years old, though we don't really know. I think, I'm not sure, that's what the Wikipedia says. When I rewatched the anime, I was like, this seems to have more fan service in it than I remember. And like, I choose to see the metaphor in their relationship, but also nothing too grand happens between them, so you can also assume kind of a brother-sister connection. But then there's the case of Danny, and that's entirely creepy. We know that. So while I was researching, I realized something specific because I was comparing these characters to the protagonists of Forest of Drizzling Rain, and those characters are only like, I think they're basically the same age, 1920 range. Anyway, they're within a year of each other, so I was like, there has to be a reason as to why Rachel's so young, and I think it has something to do with the gothic elements. As Botting shows, Zach and Rachel twist the gothic tropes of the heroine and the older male villain into something more familial, more romantic, more like companionship, by making them two sides of the same coin and never quite giving people an explicit answer as to what their relationship really is, because it's not about that. And what I mean by more romantic is more shoujo, more tropey, less like Dracula, less like Nosferatu. Quote, the sense of power and persecution beyond reason or morality is played out in the two central figures of the narratives, a young female heroine and an older male villain. The latter, beyond law, reason, or social restraint, gives free rein to cruel, selfish desires and ambitions and violent moods and intentions. His object, the body or wealth of the heroine, registers danger in a series of frights and flights. Prey to imagined as well as actual dangers, quick to lose rational control and give way or faint in fear of bandits, murderers, ghosts where there may be none. Heroines enjoy an unusual if daunting degree of independence, often drawn by misunderstanding and curiosity into situations that lead to a sense of powerlessness and persecution. Her vulnerability and his violence play out the lawlessness and insecurity manifested in settings and landscapes. Their distance from social and familial bonds is simultaneously the locus of adventurous romantic independence and physical danger. She may be active but is alone, with nowhere to turn, without protection and security. He, outside social scrutiny, is able to act out all manner of unacceptable wishes unchecked. Rachel is the prisoner because she wants to be something she is not, which is healthy, happy, sane. Zach is free but also not because he has no inhibitions, he has no control. This is why Gray calls him an angel. He is simple and he is honest. And so part of his villainhood is actually to be helpful to Rachel because he isn't a typical gothic masculine protagonist, but he is older because he fits the trope. Quote, "It was the purpose of the libertine to dishonor the stainless girl. Before he left her presence, before daybreak, she would be a polluted thing whose name and virtue and soul would be blasted forever. While enchaining the mind of the maiden with a story full of romance, it was his intention to wake her animal nature into full action. And when her veins were all alive with fiery pulsations, when her heart grew animate with sensual life, when her eyes swam in the humid moisture of passion, then she would sink helplessly into his arms, and, like the bird to the snake, flutter to her ruin." That is Lippard quoted from Riviera, and that is in the Bibliography. Quite literally, Zack chops Gray's giant snake in half on the second level. Zack is helping her not fall prey to the actual villains of the story, so this is another way that they go against these gothic tropes while at the same time catering to them. I truly think it's an intentional artistic choice to nod at the prevailing gothic literature because it's one of the things that helps give the story depth. There is also a lot of talk about facial expressions and what's behind the eyes when it comes to the characters of Zack, Danny, and Rachel. Zack decides not to kill Rachel because of the empty expression she adopts after fixing the dead bird's wing, and Danny tries to keep her alive because her eyes are similar to those of his dead mother. Eddie doesn't have an expression at all, and Kathy hides behind cameras. Gray appears to be able to see, but his eyes are designed to look like those of a blind man. So he could be blind. We don't know. There is an attempt on everyone's part to recognize something in the other, but their attempts to focus consistently elate and disgust them because they are disgusted and elated at the prospect of themselves. Whatever they seek to find is meant to confirm their beliefs about the world, and they specifically do not like Rachel because she consistently fails to meet anyone's expectations whatsoever. She shatters their fantasies because she herself is shattered or her own. Everyone is a part of her journey. As she matures, so do they, and so again, there's a specific reason as to why she's so young. It could have something to do with Otana, but it could also be as simple as catering to a trope, not for romantic reasons, but for stylistic reasons. Now it is time to talk about the theater of the absurd and Samuel Beckett. The theater of the absurd was an offshoot of existentialism, so it was not exactly associated with the original movement. It was kind of its own thing. Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot, is probably one of the most famous existentialist works and focuses on the problem of Babel. What I mean by this is that one of the premises of the theater of the absurd is that the human situation is meaningless, and repeated attempts to find meaning dissolves into nonsense, and this is reflected in the breakdown of language. To quote Estlin, I got this from Wikipedia, by the way, though I did find the actual book. The theater of the absurd attacks the comfortable certainties of religious or political orthodoxy. It aims to shock its audience out of complacency, to bring it face to face with the harsh facts of the human situation as these writers see it. But the challenge behind this message is anything but one of despair. It is a challenge to accept the human condition as it is, in all its mystery and absurdity, and to bear it with dignity, nobly, responsibly, precisely because there are no easy solutions to the mysteries of existence, because ultimately man is alone in a meaningless world. The shedding of easy solutions, of comforting illusions, may be painful, but it leaves behind it a sense of freedom and relief. And that is why, in the last resort, the theater of the absurd does not provoke tears of despair, but the laughter of liberation. In my original video recording, I pointed out that Makoto Sanada studied theater in high school and drama in college. When he started making RPGs, his knowledge of the stage, how dialogue works, the development of plot, staging elements, etc. came through. His video games are in the 2D style, and in this style, you're able to utilize lighting and space to set the mood of a level. You're only able to add in minimal props and features, and usually when you do, you want everything you add to count towards either setting the mood, developing a theme, or furthering the plot. So bearing that in mind, plays in the absurd style have minimal props and features, and Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot, is literally about two men waiting for the appearance of God. I think that there is like a single tree as a prop. But anyway, God never shows up. While they're waiting, they talk about various things, including the Bible. For example, I find this passage particularly interesting in relation to angels of death. Also, when I do this, I'm not going to say their names except for the first time, the first dialogue change, because one of the things about Waiting for Godot is that it's like they're all like one-liners, so they go back and forth, and so if you're constantly saying their names, it really removes the immersion. Vladimir. It'll pass the time. Two thieves crucified at the same time as our Savior. One Estragon. Our what? Our Savior. Two thieves. One is supposed to have been saved, and the other damned. Saved from what? Hell. I'm going. He does not move. And yet, how is it, this is not boring to you, I hope, how is it that of the four evangelists, only one speaks of a thief being saved? The four of them were there or thereabouts, and only one speaks of a thief being saved. Come on, Gogo, return the ball, can't you, once in a way? Now, if you remember Rachel's behavior, she has an obsession with keeping things, people, or animals as her own. The reason she wants Zack to kill her is a form of atonement for trying to possess people and things by killing them. If he kills her, that to her is a form of possession. Not only that, but both Rachel and Zack steal everyone's fantasies from them. Once the veil has been torn away, there's nowhere for anyone to hide from their actions. Everyone is either dead or about to die as Zack and Rachel leave. There are also four people that they do this to: Gray, Danny, Kathy, Eddie. Leaving their world means entering the external world along with its systems. Rachel is saved by the system while the system condemns Zack, which is an interesting concept for a different time. This entire parallel is pretty interesting to me, even if it means nothing, given that the entire story is about discovering that God is inside yourself. There is no such thing, really, in this case, as an external God. An external God could never give anyone in that building peace because people are responsible for their own happiness. God is too busy to answer the prayers of those who have made themselves helpless. To quote Waiting for Godot again, this time I will say both of their names when they speak. Estragon. Who? Vladimir. Godot. Estragon. Good idea. Vladimir. Let's wait till we know exactly how we stand. Estragon. On the other hand, it might be better to strike the iron before it freezes. Vladimir. I'm curious to hear what he has to offer. Then we'll take it or leave it. Estragon. What exactly did we ask him for? Vladimir. Were you not there? Estragon. I can't have been listening. Vladimir. Oh, nothing very definite. Estragon. A kind of prayer. Vladimir. Precisely. Estragon. A vague supplication. Vladimir. Exactly. Estragon. And what did he reply? Vladimir. That he'd see. Estragon. That he couldn't promise anything. Vladimir. That he'd have to think it over. Estragon. In the quiet of his home. Vladimir. Consult his family. Estragon. His friends. Vladimir. His agents. Estragon. His correspondence. Vladimir. His books. Estragon. His bank account. Vladimir. Before taking a decision. Estragon. It's the normal thing. Vladimir. Is it not? Estragon. I think it is. Vladimir. I think so too. Sorry, that made me laugh. It's so fucking funny. Estragon. And we? Vladimir. I beg your pardon. Estragon. I said, and we? Vladimir. I don't understand. Estragon. Where do we come in? Vladimir. Come in? Estragon. Take your time. Vladimir. Come in on our hands and knees. Estragon. As bad as that? Vladimir. Your worship wishes to assert his prerogatives? Estragon. We've no rights anymore? Vladimir. You'd make me laugh if it wasn't prohibited. Estragon. We've lost our rights? Vladimir. We got rid of them. And here's the stage direction. Silence. They remain motionless, arms dangling, heads sunk, sagging at the knees. In the effort to find God, one relinquishes his or her own right to be happy, to be at peace, to live. In the effort to combat the other, to drive him off, to reject our own projection, we find ourselves. The moral of Angels of Death is scattered in the confusion of what appears to be real and what appears to be unreal. All that's left is anyone's humanity, and so that is the only thing we are really supposed to take away from the game, the manga, the anime. In the end, the only chance we have at happiness is to become our own gods. So that is my essay on Angels of Death, my very informal essay for my podcast. This has been the episode. I am so glad if you made it this far. I do not know how long this is, but I'm afraid to check. As a parting gift, my friend from college just released a song called "Who Am I?" Who am I? Question mark. Her name is Eva Snyder, and you should go listen to it because it reminded me a little bit of this episode and potentially a topic that we will explore again later with other anime. So I am very excited to release and get over with my ouroboros episodes. It has been a time, it has been fun. And the third episode is still yet to come. But I do have some exciting things planned for what comes after that. Also, final thing, fun little announcement. As someone who's a fan of Brand New, the bands, they were previously never going to tour again. They are touring this March. Like, there's only like 3 or 4 shows. I'm not totally sure. I really hope people can go, so I'm making a little announcement for that. So if you like that band, please go see them. I love them. They are wonderful. I am sure it's going to be a night to remember, once in a lifetime opportunity. Yeah, so that's the episode. Have a good rest of your week.